train slowed to a stop, but the crowd didn't cheer this time. No music, no cameras, just silence, and an old man looking out the window. Once, this train changed elections, changed hearts, changed America. But today, it carries something else. A truth they never told you. A final ride they tried to erase. Because what happened next wasn't just political history. It was a goodbye to something much deeper and far more dangerous. A goodbye that America never recovered from. Welcome to Historia Unseen. My name is John, and I'm the voiceover artist for this channel. Let me take you on a story you were never meant to hear. The train was never supposed to stop there, but it did. And what happened next changed America forever. Not with war, not with blood, but with a microphone, a whistle, and a smile. This is not just about a train. It's about how one steel machine became the voice of a nation, how it carried more than people. It carried hope, fear, dreams, and lies. And why its final journey was never shown in your school books. Because this was not just the birth of a campaign, it was the birth of a new America. And this is how it all began. Smoke rolled into the early morning sky. The engine hissed as steam curled around the tracks. It was 1934, and in a small town in Iowa, people gathered like it was a parade. But there were no floats, no marching bands, only a strange, shining train, and a man standing on the back of it, waving. He wasn't a movie star. He wasn't a king. He was a politician. And this was his stage. The train didn't stop at fancy cities or big stadiums. It stopped at towns most maps forgot. Places where shoes had holes, and hearts had even bigger ones. The people came with babies in arms. Old farmers stood beside young factory boys. Mothers with tired faces smiled for the first time in months. They didn't come to vote. They came to feel like they mattered. And when that man, Franklin D. Roosevelt, spoke through the crackling speaker, they listened, not because of what he promised, but because of how he made them feel. Like they were seen, like they were heard, like they still belonged to something bigger. This was the Whistle Stop campaign, and nobody had seen anything like it before. At a time when the Great Depression had crushed spirits, and dust storms swallowed farms whole, these trains became lifelines. Steel giants, carrying hope, stop by stop, town by town, vote by vote. Roosevelt didn't just speak. He told stories. He laughed. He leaned over the rail and looked people in the eye. It was raw. It was real. It was revolutionary. His opponents mocked him. They said trains were old-fashioned, that no serious leaders should be waving from a railcar. But the people didn't care about style. They cared about connection. And every time the whistle blew, more people showed up. They came with dirty hands, but clean hearts, with pain in their eyes and hope in their pockets. Roosevelt wasn't the only one to ride the rails, but he made it matter. The train became more than a vehicle. It was a moving theater, a mobile war room, a stage with no walls. And soon, other politicians copied him. Whistle Stop became a weapon, a way to win, not just with policies, but with presence. The campaign trail was no longer a path. It was a railway line, and every town it touched felt like the center of the world. But behind the smiles and handshakes, something else was growing. The media was watching, shaping opinions with headlines. Cameras began to follow. Crowds got bigger, and so did the lies. The train was still the same, but the game had changed. Whispers of staged speeches, planted questions, deals made between stops. The Whistle Stop was still a show, but now it had a script. Still, for the people in the dust and date, that train, that voice, that moment, was all they had. It was magic on wheels, and they believed. But nothing stays the same forever. Even the strongest trains lose steam. And one day, that whistle would blow, for the very last time. But that's a story for another stop. The sun rose over Kentucky. The air smelled like coal and coffee. And on a quiet platform, someone shouted, "He's here. The president's train is coming." The crowd moved fast. Men in hats pushed forward. Mothers lifted their kids onto shoulders. And somewhere in the noise, a young girl held a sign made of cardboard and hope. The whistle blew once, then twice, and the steel monster arrived. But it wasn't fear the people felt. It was electricity, excitement, A strange kind of pride. The back door of the train opened, and there he was, Harry S. Truman. Not tall, not rich-looking, just a man in glasses and a wrinkled suit, smiling like he already knew everyone there. He didn't wave like a king. He waved like a neighbor. Truman's 1948 campaign wasn't supposed to work. The newspapers laughed at him. His own party doubted him. But Truman had a secret weapon, the rails. He stepped onto that wooden back deck, gripped a microphone, and spoke like he was in someone's living room. No teleprompters, no makeup, no safety net, just a voice, a train, and the raw honesty of a man who had nothing to lose. And the people, they loved him for it. He didn't speak at them. He spoke with them. He told jokes. He called out liars. He told the truth, even when it hurt. And every time the train stopped, the crowd grew bigger, from 20 people in Ohio, to 500 in Illinois, to 10,000 in St. Louis. By the time he reached California, he wasn't the underdog anymore. He was the train man, the comeback kid, the voice of the working class. People handed him pies, handmade quilts, letters from children. Some just stood in tears, not from sadness, but because they finally felt like someone up there cared. The Whistle Stop campaign wasn't just about winning votes. It was about touching lives. Truman's team worked non-stop, sleeping in short shifts, writing speeches between stops, checking maps, dodging storms. The train was always moving, and so was the mission. Every station was a battlefield. Every handshake, a bullet of trust. Every smile, a shield of hope. And behind it all was the rumble of wheels on track, like the heartbeat of a rising nation. But glory always casts a shadow. There were protesters too, shouts in the distance, signs that read liar or traitor. And there were towns where the train didn't stop, by design, places where the crowd was too small, or too angry, or just too forgotten. That's the part no one likes to mention, that even the best campaigns leave people behind. But Truman kept going. He stopped at over 350 towns, gave more than 300 speeches, and smiled through rain, sun, and scandal. When he returned to Washington, he was exhausted, but confident. He had done something no one expected. He had brought the Whistle Stop back to life. And on election night, as the results came in, the world gasped. Truman had won. A man with no money, no big media support, and a dead campaign had beaten the odds. On a train. That photo, Truman holding up the false Dewey defeats Truman headline, wasn't just a moment of victory. It was proof. Proof that even in a world of rising technology, steel and sweat could still win. But history has a funny way of working, because even as Truman's train ride became legend, the days of the Whistle Stop were numbered. The cameras got bigger, the audiences stopped showing up, and behind closed doors, a new question was rising. Do we even need the train anymore? But before it faded, the Whistle Stop had one last blaze of glory. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real. And for a moment in 1948, the rails still ruled, the wheels still turned, and the people still believed. But belief doesn't last forever, and the next part of this journey gets much darker. The stations still look the same. Same red bricks, same wooden benches, same smell of coal and dust in the air. But something had changed. The crowd was smaller, the cheers were quieter, and some people didn't even stop walking when the train arrived. It was 1952, and the world wasn't standing still anymore. America had new toys now. Television sets in living rooms, shiny cars on highways, and airplanes that flew above the rails like birds laughing at old machines. The Whistle Stop train still came, but it was no longer the star of the show. Now, the cameras followed people in suits inside hotel rooms. Now, the voices that mattered came from TV studios, not train balconies. One by one, the stations that once shook with excitement turned quiet again. Dust covered the old banners. Microphones rusted in storage boxes, and the faces on the platforms looked more tired than thrilled. The politicians still gave speeches, but something was missing. Connection, warmth, truth. They now read from scripts, smiled into cameras, spoke to millions, but looked into no one's eyes. The train still moved, but the country had stopped listening. Some campaign teams begged their candidates to ride the rails again. People miss the old way, they said. They want to feel close again. But others disagreed. It's slow, it's outdated, it's not modern enough. So they built stages inside studios, used lights, makeup on top of makeup, and slowly, the train turned from symbol to shadow. Behind closed doors, the train cars sat quietly, once full of advisors and laughter and paper plans, now full of silence. The crew still kept it running. They polished the brass, cleaned the windows, warmed the engine before every journey, even if no one cared. Sometimes, the train would stop in a town where no one showed up. No music, no cheers, just a lonely flag in the wind. And inside, a man in a suit would step outside, give a 3-minute speech to 4 people and a dog, then step back in. The magic was gone. Even the press had moved on. Why chase a train when the real action was now inside a glowing box? Television gave candidates a new way to lie, with perfect lighting and fake smiles. And voters didn't have to leave their chairs. Why walk to the station when you could be sold a dream from your couch? The train was too real, too raw, too human. And humans make mistakes. A slip of the tongue on a platform could cost everything. But a mistake on TV, that could be edited, erased, controlled. And so, station by station, town by town, the whistle stop faded. People forgot how it felt to look someone in the eyes as they asked for your vote, to shake a hand full of grease and sweat, to hear a voice not from a speaker, but from a soul. There were still whispers of it. Old folks told stories. Kids played with toy trains in memory. But for most, it became just another picture in a dusty history book. And for the men who once ruled those rails, there was only silence. One campaign manager stood alone on a platform in Kansas, watching a freight train pass by. He didn't say a word. He just took off his hat and whispered, "It's over." But history doesn't end in silence. Not yet, because while the world looked forward, one final chapter was still waiting in the shadows. A lost ride, a lost message, and one final stop that would change everything. Not with hope this time, but with heartbreak. The newspapers had already written him off. Too old, too weak, too honest for today's politics. But Harry Truman didn't care. He had heard it all before. And once again, he turned to the only thing that never lied to him: the train. It was 1952, and Truman knew his time was almost up. The cameras now followed newer faces, polished ones, with younger smiles and expensive suits. The world had moved on, but not Harry. He wasn't chasing votes anymore. He was chasing something else. Closure. The train rolled out one final time, not as a campaign tool, but as a farewell. No loud speeches, no roaring crowds, just a man on a rail car saying goodbye. It started in Missouri, his home state, where he waved at a handful of people in folding chairs. Some held signs, some just held each other. They weren't there for politics. They were there for him. He looked tired, his smile slower, his words softer, but the heart still the same. At every stop, he thanked the people for their trust, for their belief, for standing by him when even the headlines didn't. "I may not be much," he said once, "but I never lied to you, and I never will." There was no campaign to win, no opponent to fight, just memories and ghosts. He visited towns where no trains had stopped in years, old stations with cracked walls, platforms overtaken by weeds. But when they heard he was coming, the people showed up. Not thousands, not even hundreds, just enough. Enough to make the train whistle echo again. Enough to prove that some things still matter. In Iowa, a farmer gave him a pie. In Indiana, a girl read him a poem. In Ohio, a boy asked, "Are you the president who smiled?" Truman bent down and said, "I tried to be." These weren't speeches. They were farewells. Not just from Truman, but from the train itself. This was the last whistle stop ride, and everyone knew it. Even the crew walked slower, as if the train itself didn't want to reach the end. One night, somewhere in Pennsylvania, Truman stood alone on the platform. No crowd, no music, just wind and silence. He looked out at the dark and whispered something to himself. No one heard it, but a reporter later said he looked like a soldier saluting a battlefield that no longer existed. When he returned to Washington, the train was quiet. The rail car, the one with the back platform, the gold trim, the speakers, was unhooked, wheeled into storage, covered with a gray tarp, like a hero being buried in silence. And Truman, he walked away, not with fireworks, not with a crowd, just a nod and a quiet goodbye. But something strange happened in the days that followed. Letters poured in, from small towns, from veterans, from people who had once stood at the tracks. They didn't talk about policies, or victories, or even politics. They talked about the train, how it made them feel seen, how it made their town feel important, even just for 5 minutes, how they never forgot the sound of the whistle, and the man who waved from the back. Truman had reminded them of something real, something human, something we don't see anymore. The train's final ride wasn't about winning, it was about remembering. And in that remembering, a legend was born, one that no camera could capture, no studio could fake, no script could write, because some stories can only happen on the rails. But this legend was fading, and in the shadows, new machines were rising, screens, advertisements, digital smiles. The world was moving fast, and no one was looking back, except for a few souls who still heard the whistle in their dreams. But soon, even the dreams would go quiet, because the next part of this story is where the train meets something it can't outrun. The railcar sat alone in the warehouse. No lights, no sound, only the soft creak of metal, slowly giving into time. The same railcar that once carried presidents, cheers, and the dreams of small towns, now sat under a sheet of dust. The whistle-stop train wasn't just parked, it was forgotten. After Truman, no one really wanted it anymore. The new politicians had other ways, smoother ways, faster ways. Airplanes took them from coast to coast in hours, without stopping, without shaking a single hand. Television made them larger than life. They didn't need to look into people's eyes anymore, just into the lens. And the crowds, they could clap from their couches now. No long train rides, no tired speeches in tiny towns. The whistle stop was too slow for the new America. Campaign managers called it wasteful. Advisors said it was outdated. Strategists laughed at the idea of riding a train through Kansas. Why bother? Votes came from big cities now, from media deals, from photo ops, not real stops. And so, the train Saturday. Rusted wheels, faded paint, silence where once there was thunder. But across the country, in old towns with closed factories and broken sidewalks, people remembered. They remembered standing in the cold, waiting for a whistle. They remembered the way their hearts beat faster as the engine came into view. They remembered the wave from the back of the train. It was the only time the president ever came to them. And now they watched candidates on television, talking about cities they'd never visit, shaking hands with people in places they'd never heard of. The train had brought people together, but the screen, it kept them apart. In 1960, John F. Kennedy used a whistle-stop train, briefly, but it wasn't the same. He was handsome, young, perfect for TV. The train was just a prop. Nixon stayed in studios. Lyndon Johnson flew from city to city. And by the 1970s, the whistle stop wasn't even mentioned anymore. The railcars were put in museums, or worse, sent to junkyards. The tracks, once proud and polished, grew weeds. Stations were boarded up, posters ripped, memories faded. But something deeper was happening too. Something no one talked about. The country was changing. People no longer believed in leaders like they used to. They didn't trust smiles, didn't listen to promises, didn't care who stood on a stage anymore. And maybe, just maybe, the train had been the last thing that felt real. With it gone, something else vanished too. The idea that leaders should come to you, that your small town, your voice, your story, was worth stopping for. Now, leaders stayed behind cameras, behind walls, above the clouds, far from the people, far from the date, far from the truth. And America, it didn't notice. It kept moving forward. Faster, colder. The old stations fell apart. Wood rotted. Signs faded. Only the wind remembered the names of the towns. And the railcar, still there, still waiting, still listening. One day, a little boy walked through a museum with his grandfather. He stopped in front of the old train car. "What's that?" the boy asked. The old man looked at it for a long time, then said, "That is where the country used to speak." But the boy didn't understand, and soon he walked away. The train stayed behind, quiet, rusting. No one heard the whistle anymore, not even in their dreams. But somewhere in the shadows of the past, a story still burned. A final ride still whispered. A last message still waited. Because even in silence, the rails remember. And in the next chapter, you'll see what happens when the train is remembered not as a tool, but as a memory, a fading heartbeat of a forgotten nation. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and behind a locked gate in a forgotten museum sat a railcar with gold trim, and no one to ride it. It had once carried presidents. Now it carried dust. No lights, no flags, no crowds, just silence. Across the country, the old tracks still ran through small towns. Some cut across empty fields. Others slipped behind crumbling factories. But few remembered what they once carried. No trains, no whistles, just stories. Stories told by old men in barbershops, by grandmothers at kitchen tables, by museum guides with tired voices and glassy eyes. They would say things like, "I remember when the president came here. We all wore our Sunday clothes. Your uncle shook his hand, right there on the platform." But the kids didn't listen. They looked at their phones. They nodded and smiled, but their eyes were somewhere else. The magic was gone. In one small town in West Virginia, an old woman named Edna kept a box under her bed. Inside was a black and white photo of a train, a waving man, and a little girl holding a sign. That little girl was her. She hadn't seen that photo in years. But one rainy afternoon, she held it again and remembered the smell of coal, the sound of cheers, the way the ground shook when the train arrived. She remembered how her father cried and how her mother smiled through her broken teeth. "It was the only time we felt like we mattered," she whispered. The photo shook in her hands, not from the wind, but from time. In another town, a teacher tried to explain the whistle-stop era to her history class, but the students didn't understand. Why would a president ride a train? Why didn't they just go on TV? Didn't they have YouTube? She smiled politely and showed them a video clip, blurry, old, black and white. Truman, waving, smiling, speaking with no script, no edits, no filters. The students watched in silence, not because they cared, but because the bell hadn't rung yet. One boy raised his hand. "He looks like my grandpa," he said. And that was it. No one asked more. No one said a word. The bell rang. The chairs squeaked. And the moment was gone. In Pennsylvania, a group of retired railway workers restored a whistle-stop car. They painted it by hand, rebuilt the floorboards, cleaned the old microphone. They didn't want it to run. They just wanted it to be seen. For 3 weeks, it sat outside the town hall. People walked past it. Some stopped to look. Most didn't. But one night, an old man came with his grandson. He stood quietly, placed his hand on the side of the railcar, and whispered, "You're still here." His grandson looked up. Who's he talking to? The old man didn't answer. He just smiled, like he was back in 1948 again. These weren't just train cars. They were time machines. Not the kind that moved through time, but the kind that held time still. The rails no longer shook. The whistles no longer cried. But the ghosts, they never left. Every bolt, every dent, every window smudge held 1,000 memories of hopes shouted into cold wind, of fears tucked into coat pockets, of children lifted on shoulders to see a man with a microphone. These weren't campaign tools. They were mirrors. Mirrors that showed what America used to be. Loud, honest, flawed, connected. And now it was screens, algorithms, noise. No more stops, no more eye contact, no more heart. But in quiet corners of the country, a few still remembered. They told the stories, kept the photos, cleaned the rust, not for glory, not for money, but because someone had to. Because if they didn't, the tracks would disappear forever, and with them, so would the truth. Because the whistle stop wasn't just a way to win votes. It was a way to see people, to hear them, to stand in front of them and say, I'm here, I care, I'm listening. And today, no one listens, but one final stop was still waiting. One train still stood ready for one last journey, a final ride, to remind the world what it once was and what it lost. The wheels groaned softly as they rolled across the track, slow, heavy, almost like the train itself knew. This was the end. It was 1996, and the old whistle-stop train had been pulled out of retirement, not for a campaign, not for a celebration, but for a funeral. The funeral of a president, Harry S. Truman. The same man who once waved from its back platform was now riding it again. But this time, he wasn't standing. His casket, draped in the American flag, sat in the center of the car, quiet, still, surrounded by silence and memories. The train passed through the same towns he had once visited, the same tracks, the same stations. But everything was different now. No bands, no signs, just a few people standing in the cold, hands on hearts, tears in their eyes. Old men saluted. Children asked who he was. Mothers whispered, he was the last one who came here. As the train moved slowly through the heart of the country, something unexpected happened. People started coming out, not in the thousands, but enough to line the fences, to wave at a flag-covered box, to say thank you. They didn't cheer, they didn't chant, they stood quietly, like the land itself was mourning. Some towns rang their church bells, others placed flowers by the rails. A few just stood in silence, hats off, hearts full. It wasn't a political moment. It was a human one. A moment when the train, once again, connected the people to something bigger. And for a brief time, the whistle stop retained, not as a campaign tool, not as a performance, but as a symbol, a reminder of when leaders met the people face to face, of when promises were spoken without scripts, of when towns that no one talks about still mattered. And when that train made its final stop, the air felt different, like something had truly ended. Not just a man's life, but a chapter in history. The rail car was placed in a museum, sealed behind glass, frozen in time. Visitors passed by. Some stopped, most didn't. But for the few who remembered, it wasn't just an exhibit, it was a grave. A grave for the kind of politics that listened, the kind of speeches that meant something, the kind of country that looked you in the eye. Years later, a filmmaker stood at that same railcar. He was making a documentary, asking people what the whistle stop era meant to them. One old conductor, now blind, said quietly, "It meant they came to us. Now they expect us to come to them." That was the truth, and it hurt. Today, candidates fly over the country in private jets. They speak into cameras, not faces. They visit swing states, not real towns. And America, it watches, but it no longer feels. The screens are bright, the ads are loud, but the connection is dead. No whistle, no smoke, no promise, just noise. But in a few corners of the country, the sound of that train still lives. Not in steel, not in tracks, but in hearts, in the stories passed down, in the black and white photos on dusty walls, in the silent tears of those who still remember the final ride. A ride that carried more than a president. It carried a nation's soul. And though the tracks now sleep under weeds and rust, the memory still moves. So the next time you see a picture of a train, or hear a soft whistle in the wind, stop and listen. Because that sound, that echo, it's not just a machine. It's a ghost of a time when America still stopped to listen.